The desert holds no mercy for those who mistake silence for weakness. Dalton Graves learned this truth the hard way. When he saw the Apache warrior crossing his property that morning, he made a decision that felt like victory. He beat the man until dust mixed with crimson in the sand, dragged him to the edge of his land, and watched him stumble away bleeding. Dalton returned to his cabin satisfied, convinced he had defended what was his. But some men carry weight that goes beyond their solitary appearance. Some men have brothers who command armies. And when Dalton opened his door the next morning and saw the horizon darkened by over 100 mounted warriors, he finally understood the difference between winning a fight and starting a war. He could never survive. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridgeline when Dalton first spotted the figure moving across the dry creek bed that marked the western edge of his property. He was standing on the porch of his cabin, coffee cup in hand, surveying the expanse of scrubland he had claimed as his own 5 seasons ago. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was his. Every rock, every twisted shrub, every stretch of cracked earth between the mountains and the flats belonged to him now, or so he told himself. The figure was on foot, which immediately set Dalton's jaw tight. Nobody walked out here unless they were desperate or foolish. He squinted against the morning glare and recognized the distinctive silhouette, the way the man moved with careful, measured steps, the traditional clothing that marked him as Apache. Dalton felt his chest tighten with familiar anger. They never learned. No matter how many times he made it clear this land was claimed, they kept crossing it like boundaries meant nothing. He set his coffee down with enough force to splash drops across the weathered wood. His hand moved to his belt, checking the familiar weight there, and he stepped off the porch. The Apache warrior hadn't changed direction, still moving with that calm, steady pace that somehow made Dalton even angrier. It was the confidence that burned him, the way these people moved through the desert like they still owned it, like the past decade hadn't changed everything. Dalton's boots kicked up small clouds as he strode forward, covering the distance between his cabin and the creek bed with aggressive purpose. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed from years of working this unforgiving land. The Apache warrior was smaller, leaner, younger maybe. As Dalton got closer, he could see the man was unarmed except for a knife at his belt, carrying only a water pouch and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The warrior saw him coming and stopped, his dark eyes tracking Dalton's approach without visible fear or concern. That calm expression made something ugly twist in Dalton's gut. He wanted to see fear. He deserved to see fear on his own land. Dalton stopped about 10 feet away, his shadow falling across the Apache warrior. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap. Dalton could hear his own breathing, heavy and aggressive. The Apache warrior's breathing was barely audible, controlled and steady. Then the warrior spoke, his voice low and even, words in a language Dalton didn't understand, but whose meaning he could guess. A request to pass through, perhaps, or an explanation of peaceful intent. It didn't matter. Dalton wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in making a point. What happened next took less than 3 minutes but would echo across the desert for days to come. Dalton's first strike came fast and brutal, a backhand that sent the Apache warrior stumbling sideways. The man tried to recover his balance, raising his hands not in attack, but in a gesture that might have been defensive or conciliatory. Dalton didn't care which. His second blow was a fist to the ribs, followed by another to the face that split skin and drew first crimson. The warrior fought back, but he was caught off guard and outweighed. Dalton's rage gave him an ugly advantage, and he used it fully. He grabbed the man by his clothing and threw him down into the dust, where the earth was hard and unforgiving. Each impact raised small clouds that hung in the still morning air, like witnesses to violence. When it was over, the Apache warrior was on his hands and knees, blood dripping from his mouth and nose into the thirsty ground. Dalton stood over him, breathing hard, knuckles scraped and aching in a way that felt righteous. "Get off my land," Dalton said, his voice rough, "and tell your people this is what happens when you cross what's mine." The warrior looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met. Dalton expected to see defeat there, or fear, or anger. Instead, he saw something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was a look that seemed to see through him, to measure him, and find him somehow smaller than he believed himself to be. Then the Apache warrior stood slowly, gathering his dropped belongings with careful movements that suggested broken ribs. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked away, heading west toward the mountains, his gait uneven but determined. Dalton watched until the figure disappeared into the heat shimmer, satisfied he had made his point clear. He returned to his cabin, poured himself fresh coffee, and spent the rest of the day working on repairs to his corral fence. By evening he had almost forgotten the morning's encounter. It was just another message sent, another line defended. The desert was full of such moments, small confrontations that established order and reminded everyone where boundaries lay. That night Dalton slept soundly, the sleep of a man who believed he had won something important. He had no way of knowing that the Apache warrior he had beaten and humiliated was named Nako. He had no way of knowing that Nako was the younger brother of Dakota, a leader whose name was spoken with respect and caution across hundreds of miles of territory. He had no way of knowing that Nako had been on a peaceful mission, carrying medicine to a distant relative's camp, and that the path across Dalton's property was the shortest route through impossible terrain. Most importantly, Dalton had no way of knowing that before dawn, Nako would reach his people, that he would stand before his brother Dakota, show his wounds, and speak the name of the man who had done this, that Dakota would listen with a face like carved stone, and then rise and walk to where the war council gathered. Dalton Graves slept peacefully in his cabin, unaware that with every hour of darkness, riders were moving across the desert, unaware that his victory was actually the lighting of a fuse, unaware that when the sun rose again, nothing in his life would ever be the same. Nako reached his people's encampment just after midnight. The moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the collection of shelters spread among the rocks. He had walked for hours, each step sending sharp pain through his ribs, his face swollen and crusted with dried blood. Two young warriors on watch duty saw him stumbling toward them and immediately called for help. Within minutes, Nako was surrounded by his people. Women brought water and cloths to clean his wounds. Men gathered close, their faces darkening as they saw the extent of his injuries. Someone went to wake Dakota. Nako sat on a flat rock near the central fire pit, allowing the women to tend to his wounds. He said nothing yet, waiting. When Dakota emerged from his shelter, the crowd parted immediately. The tribal leader was a tall man with broad shoulders and a presence that seemed to fill the space around him. His hair, streaked with early gray, was pulled back from a face carved by years of hard decisions and harder losses. He had led his people through drought, through conflicts with other tribes, through the increasing pressure of settlers claiming land that had belonged to the Apache for generations. Dakota approached his younger brother and knelt beside him, studying his injuries with a careful eye. He said nothing at first, simply observing. The gathered crowd remained silent, waiting. After a long moment, Dakota spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Who did this to you?" Nako met his brother's gaze. "A settler. His cabin sits where the old path crosses toward the eastern springs. I was passing through, carrying medicine for Uncle Nalnish. He attacked without warning, without words I could understand. He beat me and told me to leave his land." Dakota's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. "Did you fight back?" "I tried. He was bigger and I was not prepared for violence. I thought he might just tell me to go around his property. I did not expect." Nako gestured to his face. "Did he know you were carrying medicine? Did he know you were simply passing through?" I tried to tell him. He did not want to hear. Dakota stood slowly, his eyes moving across the faces of the gathered people. Everyone was awake now, drawn by the commotion. Children peered from behind their parents. Elders stood in doorways, their weathered faces grave. They all knew what this meant. An unprovoked attack on one of their own, especially on the brother of their leader, could not be ignored. To ignore it would be to invite more violence, to signal weakness, to suggest that Apache lives held no value. One of the senior warriors, a man named Chuvio, stepped forward. "Dakota, this cannot stand. If settlers believe they can beat our people with no consequence, more will follow. We must respond." Dakota nodded slowly. "Yes, we must. But we must respond with strength, not rashness. We must show this man, and any others who might follow his example, that we are not helpless victims to be struck down when convenient." He turned to Chuvio and two other respected warriors. "Send riders to the camps within half a day's travel. Ask them to send their warriors to meet us at dawn. We will gather our strength. We will show this settler what it means to strike an Apache." The warriors departed immediately, moving to their horses with practiced efficiency. Dakota watched them go, then returned his attention to Nako. "This settler. Did you see anything else about his place? How many others live there? Does he have family? I saw only him. The cabin stands alone, far from other settlements. There were horses in a corral, supplies stacked on the porch. He lives isolated. Good, Dakota said quietly. Then he will have no one to help him when the sun rises. Throughout the night, riders returned with warriors from neighboring camps. They came in small groups, arriving on horseback with weapons and determined expressions. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, over 100 warriors had gathered. They stood in loose formation, checking their weapons, speaking in low voices, their horses stamping restlessly. Dakota addressed them as dawn approached, his voice carrying across the assembled group. A settler beat my brother yesterday for the crime of crossing land that has been Apache territory for longer than any of us have been alive. He beat him brutally and sent him away bleeding. This man believes he can strike us without consequence. Today, we will teach him differently. Today, we will show him what it means to harm one of our people. We ride now. The warriors mounted their horses in near silence. The only sounds were leather creaking, metal touching metal, hooves shifting in dirt. Then Dakota raised his hand and pointed east, toward the rising sun, toward Dalton Graves's isolated cabin. They moved as one, over 100 mounted warriors crossing the desert in the pale dawn light. The sound of their passage was like distant thunder, a rumble that grew louder with each mile covered. Dust rose behind them in a massive cloud, marking their progress across the land. Dalton Graves still slept, unaware that his last peaceful morning had already ended. Dalton woke to a sound that didn't belong. It was deep and rhythmic, like distant drums, but not quite. He lay still for a moment, his mind foggy with sleep, trying to identify what had pulled him from unconsciousness. Then it came again, clearer now. Thunder. Except the sky had been clear when he went to sleep, and the sound was too steady, too controlled. He sat up, his bare feet finding the cold floor. Morning light filtered through the gaps in his window shutters, painting thin lines across the room. The sound continued, growing neither louder nor softer. It was constant, patient, waiting. Dalton moved to the window and pushed open one shutter just enough to peer through. What he saw made his breath stop in his chest. Warriors. Everywhere. They formed a massive circle around his cabin, mounted on horses, weapons visible in the golden dawn light. Some held rifles, others carried traditional weapons, bows, lances, axes. They sat motionless, an impossible number of them, their horses standing as still as their riders. The sight was so overwhelming that for a moment Dalton's mind refused to process it. It seemed unreal, like something from a fever dream, but it was real. Over 100 Apache warriors surrounded his property, positioned at every angle, cutting off every possible escape route. The thunder he had heard was the sound of their arrival, the rumble of countless hooves that had stopped just beyond his walls. Dalton stepped back from the window, his heart hammering. His hands shook as he reached for his rifle, checking the chamber with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. He had perhaps 20 rounds of ammunition in his cabin, 20 rounds against over 100 men. He forced himself to look again, and this time he focused on details. The warriors weren't attacking. They weren't charging or firing. They were simply there, watching, waiting. In the center of the formation, slightly closer to the cabin than the others, sat a warrior on a dark horse. This man had an air of authority that was visible even from a distance. He sat straight and calm, his gaze fixed on Dalton's cabin with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Dalton's mind raced, trying to understand. Why were they here? What did they want? Then, with sick certainty, he remembered the Apache warrior from yesterday. The beating, the blood in the dust, the way he had sent the man stumbling away injured. This was about that. This had to be about that. But it was impossible. One Apache warrior, traveling alone, couldn't have connections important enough to bring this kind of response. Could he? Dalton felt ice forming in his stomach as he realized he might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. He moved to his door, pressing his ear against the wood. He could hear nothing but the occasional snort of a horse, the creak of leather, the whisper of wind across the desert. No voices, no shouts, no demands, just presence, just waiting. Dalton backed away from the door and sat heavily on his bed, the rifle across his lap. His mind spun through options. He could try to fight, but that was suicide. He could try to run, but there was nowhere to go. Every direction was blocked. He could try to surrender, but would they accept it? Would they even let him speak before they struck him down? He thought about the way he had beaten that warrior yesterday, the satisfaction he had felt, the righteousness. He had been so certain of his power, so confident in his right to defend his claimed territory. Now that certainty felt like the thinnest tissue, ready to tear at the slightest pressure. Hours passed, though Dalton couldn't have said how many. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to build. Still, the warriors sat motionless. Still, they waited. Dalton moved between his windows, checking each angle, counting the men over and over as if the numbers might change. They never did. He tried to drink water but found his throat too tight to swallow properly. He tried to think of a plan, but found his thoughts scattered and useless. All he could do was wait, trapped in his own cabin by an army he had somehow created through one morning's violence. As afternoon approached, the warrior on the dark horse finally moved. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He handed his reins to another warrior and began walking toward the cabin. He walked alone, unarmed as far as Dalton could see, his pace measured and unhurried. Dalton gripped his rifle tighter, his palms slick with sweat. The warrior stopped about 20 feet from the cabin door, close enough that Dalton could see his face clearly through the window. The man's expression was calm, almost serene, but his eyes held something that made Dalton's blood feel cold. Then the warrior spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, speaking words Dalton didn't understand but whose meaning he could guess with terrible accuracy. This was not a negotiation. This was not a warning. This was judgment, delivered with the patience of someone who already knew the outcome. Dalton stood frozen behind his door, the rifle trembling in his grip. The warrior outside waited with inhuman patience, his dark eyes fixed on the cabin as if he could see through the wooden walls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke again, this time in broken but understandable English. "My name is Dakota. The man you beat yesterday is Nako, my brother." The words hit Dalton like physical blows. Brother. The Apache warrior he had brutalized was the brother of this man, this leader who commanded over 100 warriors. The full weight of his mistake crashed down on him with crushing force. "Come out," Dakota continued, his voice calm and measured. "We will speak. You will not be harmed if you come out now." Dalton's mind raced. Could he trust that promise? He looked at the rifle in his hands, then out at the massive circle of warriors. Even if he killed Dakota, the others would tear his cabin apart within seconds. There was no path forward through violence. There never had been. With shaking hands, Dalton set the rifle down and moved to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, drawing a breath that felt like it might be one of his last. Then he opened it. The sunlight was blinding after hours inside the dim cabin. Dalton squinted, stepping out onto his porch. The heat hit him immediately, dry and oppressive. Dakota stood where he had been, unmoved, studying Dalton with an expression that revealed nothing. "Yesterday you beat my brother," Dakota said. "He was crossing this land carrying medicine to our uncle. He meant no harm. He was not stealing. He was not threatening. He was simply passing through territory that has been used by our people for longer than you have been alive." Dalton wanted to argue, to explain about property rights and claims and boundaries, but the words died in his throat. How could he explain concepts of ownership to a man whose people had walked these paths for generations? How could he justify beating an unarmed traveler to someone who now held his life in their hands? "He tried to speak with you," Dakota continued. "He tried to tell you he meant no trouble. You did not listen. You struck him. You broke his ribs. You split his face open. You sent him away bleeding, with no care if he would survive the journey home." Each sentence was delivered with that same calm tone, but Dalton could hear the controlled rage beneath it. This was a man holding back violence through sheer force of will. "I have brought these warriors to show you something," Dakota said, gesturing to the circle of mounted men. "I want you to understand what it means to attack one of us. When you beat my brother, you did not beat a lone traveler. You beat the brother of a leader. You beat a man whose family numbers in the hundreds. You beat someone who is protected by the strength of an entire people." Dakota stepped closer, and Dalton instinctively backed up until his spine hit the cabin wall. The Apache leader stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Dalton could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair, the absolute certainty in his expression. "Now you will understand what it feels like," Dakota said quietly. "To be powerless, to be surrounded, to know that your life hangs on the mercy of someone stronger." Dalton's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What do you want?" "Justice," Dakota replied. My brother bled because of you. You must answer for that. You will leave this cabin. You will stand before my warriors. You will face judgment for what you have done. And if I refuse," Dakota's expression didn't change, "then we will remove you by force. And the judgment will be far less merciful." Dalton looked past Dakota at the circle of warriors. Every eye was on him. Every face was set with grim purpose. These were not men who had come to negotiate or discuss. These were men who had come to see justice done, by whatever means necessary. He thought about running back inside, barricading the door, making them come get him. But what would that accomplish except a more violent end? He thought about pleading, about begging for forgiveness, about offering compensation. But he could see in Dakota's eyes that words would mean nothing now. Action had created this situation. Only action would resolve it. "I will come out," Dalton said, his voice hollow. "But I want to know what you intend to do." "That," Dakota said, "depends on you. How you face this moment will determine what comes next. Come, walk with me to the center of the circle." Dakota turned and began walking away from the cabin, not looking back to see if Dalton would follow. It was a test, Dalton realized, a demonstration of power more profound than any threat. Dakota was so certain of his control over this situation that he could turn his back on an armed man and walk away without concern. Dalton stood on his porch for a long moment, looking at his cabin one last time. Then he stepped down and followed Dakota toward the waiting circle of warriors, toward whatever judgment awaited him in the dust and heat of the desert morning. The walk from his cabin to the center of the warrior circle felt longer than any journey Dalton had ever taken. Each step took him farther from the safety of walls and closer to men who had every reason to want him dead. The warriors parted slightly to let them pass, but their eyes never left him. Dalton could feel their hatred like physical weight pressing against his skin. Dakota stopped in the center of the circle and turned to face Dalton. The warriors closed ranks behind them, forming an unbroken wall of men and horses. There was no escape now. No path out, no mercy waiting in any direction. "Kneel," Dakota said simply. Dalton's legs refused to move at first. Everything in him rebelled against showing submission. But as he looked around at the circle of armed warriors, reality crushed his pride. Slowly, his knees bent, and he lowered himself to the hard ground. Dust rose around him, coating his hands as he braced himself. Dakota circled him slowly, speaking loud enough for all the warriors to hear. His words came in Apache first, then in English, ensuring both his people and Dalton understood every word. "This man beat my brother Nako yesterday. He struck an unarmed traveler without cause. He drew blood on land that is not truly his to claim. He acted with the arrogance of someone who believes might makes right." The warriors murmured in agreement. A low rumble of anger that made Dalton's skin crawl. He kept his eyes on the ground, not daring to look up. "Our laws say that violence must be answered. Blood calls for blood. Pain demands payment." Dakota paused directly in front of Dalton. "What do you say to this? Do you deny what you did?" Dalton forced himself to speak, his voice cracking. "I did not know he was your brother. I did not know who he was. Would it have mattered?" Dakota's question cut through the air like a blade. "If he had been no one important, would that have made your violence acceptable? If he had been alone in the world, with no family to defend him, would that have given you the right to beat him?" Dalton had no answer. The truth was ugly and impossible to defend. He had beaten Nako because he could, because the man was alone and unarmed, because Dalton had felt powerful enough to act without consequence. The fact that Nako turned out to be connected to people who could respond had changed nothing about the fundamental nature of what Dalton had done. "You are a coward," Dakota said, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. "You attacked someone you thought was helpless. You drew strength from your victim's weakness. That is not the action of a strong man. That is the action of someone who fears his own smallness." The words burned more than any physical blow could have. Dalton felt his face flush with shame and anger, but he remained silent. What could he say that would matter? Dakota knelt down, bringing himself level with Dalton's bowed head. "Look at me," he commanded. Dalton raised his eyes slowly. Dakota's face was inches from his own, close enough that Dalton could see every line. Every scar, every mark of a life lived with purpose and principle. "I could have you beaten as you beat my brother," Dakota said quietly. "I could have every warrior here take turns until you understand pain, the way Nako understood it. I could burn your cabin, scatter your livestock, leave you with nothing but the memory of this day. Dalton's breath came in shallow gasps. Please, but I will not, Dakota continued, cutting off Dalton's plea. Because we are not you. We do not act from cruelty or cowardice. We act from justice and necessity. Dakota stood, addressing his warriors again. This man will live, but he will carry a mark that reminds him of what he has done. And he will leave this place, never to return. Two warriors dismounted and approached. They pulled Dalton to his feet, holding his arms firmly, but not brutally. Dakota produced a knife from his belt, the blade catching sunlight. Dalton's heart hammered as he watched the weapon approach. Dakota reached for Dalton's shirt and cut a long strip from the shoulder, exposing pale skin beneath. Then, with careful precision, he used the knife to cut a shallow line across Dalton's shoulder, just deep enough to draw blood and leave a scar. The pain was sharp and immediate, but controlled. This was not torture. This was marking. This scar will remind you, Dakota said as blood seeped down Dalton's arm. Every time you see it, you will remember this day. You will remember that actions have consequences. You will remember that the people you strike down are not without defenders. The warriors released Dalton, and he staggered slightly, his hand moving to his bleeding shoulder. Dakota gestured toward the cabin. Take what you can carry. You have until the sun reaches its highest point to leave. If you are still here after that, my warriors will ensure you leave with nothing but your life, and that is more mercy than you deserve. Dalton stumbled back toward his cabin, his legs weak and unsteady. Behind him, the warriors remained motionless, watching, waiting to see if he would be foolish enough to resist this final mercy. Dalton stumbled into his cabin, blood still seeping through his fingers where he pressed them against his shoulder. The wound burned with steady throbbing pain that matched the rhythm of his racing heart. He leaned against the doorframe, breathing hard, trying to steady himself enough to think clearly. The cabin looked different now. What had been his domain, his fortress, his proof of successful conquest, now felt like a prison he was being released from. Every object he had worked to acquire, every improvement he had made, every mark of his presence here suddenly meant nothing. He had until the sun reached its highest point to gather what he could carry and leave everything else behind. He moved through the space mechanically, his hands shaking as he pulled down a canvas bag from a shelf. What do you take when you are forced to abandon everything? What matters when you have only hours to choose? He grabbed a spare shirt, hesitated, then took two more. A blanket, his best knife, a length of rope, water skins that he filled from his barrel with trembling hands. Food. He would need food. He wrapped dried meat in cloth, added hardtack that would keep for weeks, a small bag of cornmeal. His hands moved faster now, driven by the pressure of passing time and the knowledge that over 100 warriors waited outside to ensure his departure. He looked at his rifle, still leaning against the wall where he had left it. For a moment he considered taking it, but what would be the point? If he tried to use it against the warriors, he would die instantly. If he carried it away, it would only be a reminder of the violence that had brought him to this moment. He left it standing where it was. The sun climbed higher. He could track its progress through his window, watching shadows shorten with each passing minute. Every moment inside the cabin brought him closer to the deadline Dakota had set. Part of him wanted to resist, to force them to drag him out, to make them work for this exile. But a larger part, the part that had knelt in the dust and felt the bite of Dakota's knife, knew that resistance would only make things worse. He moved to the small wooden box where he kept the few valuable things he owned. A pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a handful of coins, a letter from his sister back east, written years ago. These went into the bag with careful hands. They were all he had left of a life before this place, before this disaster. His eyes moved around the cabin, taking inventory of what he would lose. The bed frame he had built himself, the table where he had eaten meals alone for 5 seasons, the shelves he had installed, the window shutters he had carved and hung, the fireplace where he had spent winter nights believing he had found a place to build something permanent. All of it would remain here. All of it would either be taken by the Apache or left to decay in the desert wind. None of it had ever truly been his. He had claimed it, defended it, marked it as his territory. But ownership turned out to be nothing more than a temporary illusion that could be shattered by consequences he had not anticipated. He thought about Nako, the Apache warrior he had beaten. Had Nako looked at this cabin and seen what Dalton saw? Had he understood that this settler had built something here, invested years of labor and hope into making this desolate place into something resembling home? Or had Nako simply seen another person claiming land that was not theirs to claim? Another barrier erected across paths his people had walked for generations. Dalton realized he had never asked. He had never wondered. He had simply acted from assumption and anger, striking out at what he perceived as a threat without considering that he might be wrong. The scar on his shoulder throbbed, a physical reminder that would never let him forget. Dakota had been precise in his punishment. The cut was not deep enough to cripple or kill, but it would leave a mark forever. Every time Dalton changed shirts, every time he washed, every time he caught sight of his own reflection, he would see that line across his skin and remember this day. Outside, he heard movement. The warriors shifting position, perhaps, or Dakota giving new orders. The sound made his stomach clench with renewed fear. Time was running short. The sun was almost at its peak. Dalton cinched the canvas bag closed and threw it over his shoulder, gasping as the weight pressed against his fresh wound. He looked around the cabin one more time, memorizing details he knew he would think about for years to come. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the harsh midday light, ready to face whatever came next. The warriors still surrounded his property in their perfect circle, motionless as statues carved from stone. Dalton stood on his porch with his canvas bag slung over his good shoulder, looking out at the wall of armed men that had destroyed his life in a single morning. The sun blazed overhead, directly at its highest point. His time was up. Dakota sat on his dark horse at the edge of the circle, watching. When he saw Dalton emerge, he raised one hand in a gesture that caused the warriors directly in front of the cabin to part, creating a narrow corridor through their ranks. It was the path Dalton was meant to take, the only path left to him. Dalton descended the porch steps slowly, each movement sending fresh pain through his shoulder. He approached the opening in the circle, acutely aware of how many weapons were trained in his direction. One wrong move, one gesture that could be interpreted as threatening, and he would be cut down before he took his next breath. As he walked between the warriors, he kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at their faces. He could feel their contempt radiating off them like heat from sun-baked rocks. These men had ridden through the night to answer their leader's call, to stand witness to justice being served, to ensure that one of their own had been defended. They had expected to see him punished, perhaps even killed. The fact that he was being allowed to walk away was a mercy he knew they disagreed with. He passed through the circle and continued walking, heading east away from his cabin. Behind him, he heard movement as some of the warriors mounted up, preparing to follow at a distance to ensure he truly left the territory. He did not look back. Looking back would make it worse, would make real what he already knew. Everything he had built was gone. The desert stretched before him, vast and indifferent. He had crossed this landscape 5 seasons ago full of ambition and certainty, believing he could carve out a piece of this harsh land and make it his own. He had succeeded after a fashion. He had built his cabin, established his claim, defended his boundaries, and now he was walking away from it all with nothing but a canvas bag and a scar that would never fade. His shoulder throbbed with each step, the pain keeping time with his heartbeat. Sweat ran down his face and stung his eyes. The bag grew heavier with each mile covered, but he did not stop. He did not rest. He walked with the desperate energy of someone who knows that stopping might mean never starting again. Hours passed. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Still Dalton walked. Behind him, at a careful distance, 3 warriors followed on horseback. They made no move to approach or harass him. They simply followed, ensuring he continued away from the territory he had claimed, making certain he understood there would be no returning. As the day wore on, Dalton's mind circled back repeatedly to the moment when he had struck Nako. He saw it now with terrible clarity. The Apache warrior trying to speak, trying to explain, trying to avoid violence. And himself, Dalton Graves, choosing to strike first, choosing violence over words, choosing to assert dominance rather than seek understanding. What would have happened if he had simply let Nako pass? The man would have continued on his journey, delivered his medicine, and probably never crossed Dalton's path again. There would have been no confrontation, no beating, no mobilization of warriors. Dalton would still be in his cabin, still be working his claim, still be living the life he had built. One decision, one moment of anger, and pride. That was all it had taken to destroy everything. The warriors following him finally turned back as sunset approached. apparently satisfied that he was truly leaving. Dalton watched them ride away, small figures silhouetted against the orange sky, returning to their people, to their leader, to the brother he had wounded. Then he was alone in the desert, a solitary figure with a bag on his back and nowhere to go. He walked until full darkness fell, until he could no longer see the path ahead. Then he collapsed beside a large rock formation, too exhausted to continue. He pulled out his blanket and wrapped it around himself, the night air already turning cold. The scar on his shoulder burned, his feet ached, his throat was raw with thirst despite the water he had drunk. As he lay there under the vast expanse of stars, Dalton understood something fundamental had changed inside him. The man who had beaten Nako yesterday no longer existed. That man had been confident in his righteousness, certain of his power, blind to consequences. The man lying in the desert tonight knew better, knew that actions ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, knew that strength without wisdom is just another form of weakness. Tomorrow he would need to figure out where to go, how to survive, what to do with whatever life remained to him. But tonight, he simply lay in the darkness, marked and exiled, paying the bitter price for bullying the wrong Apache. 6 months had passed since Dalton Graves walked away from his cabin in the desert. 6 months of wandering, of working odd jobs in small settlements far from the territory he had once claimed. 6 months of living with the scar on his shoulder that burned whenever he saw his own reflection. He found himself in a small trading post near the edge of what people called civilized territory. The work was simple, loading and unloading wagons, repairing harnesses, doing whatever needed doing in exchange for meals and a place to sleep in the back storage room. It was nothing like the life he had imagined for himself when he first headed west. But it was honest work, and he was alive to do it. The scar had healed but remained visible, a raised line of paler skin that drew questions he never answered. People assumed it came from some accident or conflict and stopped asking when he made clear he would not discuss it. Let them wonder. The truth was his burden to carry, not theirs. One afternoon, a traveler came through the trading post. A man who had crossed through the desert territories Dalton once knew. The man spoke of changes in the region, of settlers learning to negotiate passage rather than claiming land outright, of new understandings being reached between different peoples. He mentioned hearing about an abandoned cabin that the Apache had left standing as a reminder, a monument to the consequences of arrogance. Dalton listened without revealing that he knew the cabin the man spoke of. His cabin, the place where he had made his catastrophic mistake. Knowing it still stood there, empty and weathered by desert wind, felt appropriate somehow. It was a grave marker for the person he used to be. He had written a letter to his sister back east, the first communication in years. In it, he did not explain what had happened or why he was no longer pursuing his Western ambitions. He simply told her he had learned important lessons about respecting others and understanding that strength without wisdom leads only to destruction. She would never understand the full story, but perhaps the lessons themselves were what mattered. The owner of the trading post, an older man named Samuel, who had seen decades of frontier life, approached Dalton one evening as he finished his work. Samuel had watched him for months, noting how he dealt with customers who were Apache or from other native tribes. There was respect in Dalton's interactions now, a careful courtesy that seemed born from hard experience rather than natural inclination. "You are not the same man who arrived here," Samuel observed, not making it a question. Dalton touched his shoulder reflexively, feeling the scar through his shirt. "No, I am not." "Good," Samuel said simply. "The frontier has no room for the man you were. It has great need for the man you are becoming." That night, Dalton sat outside the trading post watching the sun set over distant mountains. He thought about Nako, wondering if the Apache warrior's injuries had healed as his own had. He thought about Dakota, and the lesson delivered with such precision and control. They could have killed him. They had every right and every reason. Instead, they had chosen to mark him and release him, gambling that the lesson would take root. It had. Dalton would never claim land again without considering who might have walked that ground before him. He would never raise his hand in violence without understanding the full weight of consequences. He would never assume that being stronger meant being right. The bitterness of those consequences had been profound. He had lost everything he had worked for, been humiliated before over 100 warriors, and carried a permanent scar as a reminder of his failure. But he had also gained something unexpected: understanding. The knowledge that different peoples could share this vast territory if they chose respect over domination. That true strength lay not in conquest, but in wisdom. Dalton Graves would never return to the desert where his old cabin stood empty. He would never seek revenge or try to reclaim what he had lost. Those dreams belonged to someone else, to the man who had beaten an unarmed traveler and paid the price. The man who sat watching the sunset now was different, marked not just by the scar on his shoulder, but by the deeper transformation that came from facing the bitter consequences of his own arrogance. He understood now, with absolute clarity, what it meant to bully the wrong Apache. It meant learning that every person you encounter might be connected to something larger than you can imagine. It meant discovering that actions ripple outward beyond your control. It meant paying a price so severe that it changes who you are forever. And perhaps, Dalton thought as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead, perhaps that change was the whole point. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable frontier tale, where choices and consequences collide in ways you never expected. Do not forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.